Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be exploring the life and works of Ramana Maharshi, a renowned Indian sage.
All right.
You're probably familiar with his teachings on self-inquiry and the path to self-realization. But did you know that Maharshi claimed that he rarely felt the urge to write?
Oh, interesting.
Even his famous 40 verses on reality were compiled from poems written at different times.
Oh, wow.
And get this, a simple recipe for papadums
Okay.
actually inspired a symbolic guide to spiritual practice.
Really?
So we're going to uncover some really fascinating insights about Maharshi's creative process and how these seemingly mundane events could spark profound spiritual reflections.
I love that.
We've got excerpts from Ramana Maharshi, the written works,
Okay.
some biographical details, and even a few of his poems to dig into.
Awesome.
So
It's interesting because, we often associate spiritual masters with volumes of writings.
Right.
But with Ramana Maharshi, it was quite different. He wasn't driven to write in the same way that many other spiritual teachers were.
So then what prompted him to create the works that we have today?
Well, a lot of it stemmed from the persistent requests of his devotees.
Oh.
They recognized the depth of his wisdom
Right.
and wanted to preserve his teachings.
It's funny, he even once said, talking about poets, all this is only activity of the mind. What use is it to acquire such accomplishments if you don't acquire peace? It sounds like he saw writing as a distraction from the true goal of inner peace.
Yes, and that quote really highlights a key aspect of his teachings. This idea that true peace doesn't come from external achievements or even mental activity, but from within.
It comes from the self, right?
Exactly.
Yet there were a few exceptions to this reluctance to write, like the 11 stanzas to Sri Arunachala and the 8 stanzas to Sri Arunachala. Those seem pretty spontaneous.
Absolutely. Maharshi described the experience of receiving those opening words as a force of nature. They just came to him while he was walking one morning, and he even tried to suppress them at first, but they wouldn't go away until he wrote them down.
Wow. It's almost like the poems wrote themselves. Do you think that that creative impulse itself was a form of spiritual guidance for him?
It's certainly possible. And these spontaneous works beautifully blend devotion, known as bhakti, with the non-dualistic philosophy of Advaita Vedanta.
Now, for those who might not be familiar with these concepts,
Right.
could you briefly explain what Bhakti and Advaita Vedanta are?
Of course. Bhakti is a path that emphasizes love and devotion to a chosen deity or the divine. Advaita Vedanta, on the other hand, is a school of thought that posits the non-duality of the self and the ultimate reality, Brahman. It suggests that there is only one reality and everything else is an illusion.
So in these poems, we see this merging of the heart and the mind,
Yes,
the devotional aspect with the philosophical understanding.
that's really powerful. And what's even more remarkable is the marital garland of 108 verses to Sri Arunachala.
Okay.
This was composed in a single session while he was walking around Arunachala Hill.
Imagine the intense emotion and focus that must have required. It's described that tears were streaming down his face as he wrote. To be so present and receptive in that state of creative flow is incredible.
And when devotees later asked him to interpret the verses, he simply said, "You think it out, and I will too. I didn't think while I was composing it. I just wrote as it came."
Oh, wow.
This points to a state of pure receptivity, allowing the words to flow without the interference of the thinking mind.
That makes me think about the idea of channeling.
Yes.
It's as if he was a conduit for something beyond his personal thoughts and ideas.
Yeah.
That's a pretty fascinating insight into his creative process.
Yeah.
What else strikes you about the way his works came into being?
Well, one thing that stands out is that even though he was considered a realized master, he often wrote from the perspective of the aspirant, the seeker. For example, in those 11 stanzas, he even uses the phrase, "one who has not attained the supreme knowledge."
That's interesting. Why do you think he chose to do that?
It seems to be a deliberate choice born out of compassion
Okay.
and a deep understanding of the human experience.
Okay.
He wasn't writing from a place of intellectual superiority,
Right.
but as a guide, meeting people where they were on their spiritual journeys.
Right.
He even confirmed this when a devotee asked him about it directly.
So he intentionally made his teachings accessible to those who are still seeking,
Yes,
which is really beautiful.
exactly. And then there's this intriguing story about a Sanskrit hymn.
Okay.
A devotee asked him to write one, and he laughed, saying he didn't know Sanskrit grammar or meters. But after the devotee explained a meter to him, he effortlessly composed 5 perfect verses in a single evening.
Wait, so he claimed he didn't know Sanskrit, but then flawlessly composed these verses.
It does.
That seems a bit contradictory to his earlier statement about not being a poet.
It does, doesn't it?
What do you make of that?
Perhaps it suggests that his humility wasn't simply a personal trait,
Right.
but a reflection of a deeper understanding of the nature of knowledge itself. It might be that he saw himself as an instrument, allowing the wisdom to flow through him,
Yep.
rather than claiming ownership of it.
That's a really profound way of looking at it. It challenges our usual notions of authorship and creativity,
Yes.
suggesting a more receptive and interconnected way of being.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look closer at these verses, we find that they beautifully embody the three main paths to realization: Jnana Yoga,
Yes.
Bhakti Yoga,
Mhm.
and Karma Yoga.
Beautiful.
Could you elaborate on those paths for our listeners?
Of course. Jnana Yoga is the path of knowledge, emphasizing self-inquiry and the direct realization of truth through contemplation.
Okay.
Bhakti Yoga, as we discuss, is the path of devotion, cultivating love and surrender to the divine. And Karma Yoga is the path of selfless action, performing one's duties without attachment to the fruits of those actions.
And these three paths, seemingly distinct, are
Right.
all woven together in these Sanskrit verses.
It speaks to the holistic nature of Maharshi's teachings,
Right.
embracing various approaches to the spiritual journey.
It's becoming clear that Maharshi wasn't just a spiritual master,
Right.
but also a master of surprise. From those spontaneous outpourings of poetry to the effortless mastery of Sanskrit, his creative process was anything but ordinary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's dive into some more examples of that.
Yeah, let's do it. And his ability to weave profound teachings into everyday experiences is truly remarkable. Remember the devotee Muruganar who was writing a poem about Siva's teachings?
Yeah, he was writing a poem and got stuck.
He got stuck and turned to Maharshi for guidance. What happened next?
Well, in true Maharshi fashion, he composed the Upadesa Saram, or instruction, in 30 verses, right then and there.
So this pivotal work, outlining a step-by-step progression from outward actions to inner contemplation, was basically created on the spot.
Yeah, to help a friend.
By help of friend. It seems spontaneity was a recurring theme in this creative process.
Indeed. And what's fascinating is that this seemingly impromptu composition became a highly revered text chanted daily alongside the Vedas, even after Maharshi's passing.
It speaks to the depth and clarity of his teachings, even when delivered in such an off-the-cuff manner. It seems like, whether it was a spontaneous poem or a requested instruction, the wisdom always flowed through.
Yeah,
Now we can't forget about the 40 verses on reality and its supplement.
right.
These are considered to be a comprehensive explanation of his teachings, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
But unlike some of his other spontaneous works, these verses were compiled over time.
Oh.
Some were even taken from other sources.
So it's like he was curating a guide to self-realization, drawing from the wisdom that resonated most deeply with him.
Exactly.
He wasn't concerned with originality or claiming authorship. His focus was purely on conveying the truth.
And it reflects a beautiful humility and practicality. He wasn't attached to the idea of being the sole source of these teachings. He simply wanted to share what he knew to be true in a way that was accessible and beneficial to all.
Okay, you ready for this? Now we're going from profound verses to papadums.
Oh yes, the famous Papadum poem.
So apparently Maharshi's mom was making these savory treats one day and asked for his help in the kitchen. And what does this master of self-realization do? He writes a poem.
Of course.
Not just any poem, but a symbolic recipe for sadhana or spiritual practice, using the steps of making papadums as an analogy for the journey towards enlightenment.
It reminds us that the path to self-discovery isn't always about grand gestures or intense practices. It can be found in the simple everyday moments if we have the eyes to see.
It's like he could find spiritual significance in even the most mundane activities. This poem, if we could find it, would be a great example of his wit and wisdom.
Absolutely. It highlights the accessibility of his teachings and his ability to draw profound connections from ordinary experiences.
Speaking of finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, there's Maharshi's final poem, the Ekatma Panchakam, meaning 5 verses on the self. Now remember how he claimed he wasn't much of a poet?
Yes, and yet he composed this beautiful poem in Telugu, adhering to a Tamil metrical form, and then translated it into Tamil.
It's like a grand finale, a culmination of his creative and spiritual journey. And the poem in itself beautifully encapsulates his core teaching, the realization of the self is the ultimate reality.
Here it really does.
As we explore these works, what stands out to you? I'm struck by the sheer diversity and the unexpected ways they came into being through requests, spontaneous inspiration, and even culinary experiences.
What's truly remarkable is how each piece, regardless of its origin or form, points back to the same fundamental truth, the self. It's a testament to his unwavering focus and the depth of his realization.
And even his translations were inspired by a desire to make profound texts accessible to others. Like his translations of Shankaracharya's Vivekachudamani and Amabodha, he wanted to share this ancient wisdom and make it relevant to contemporary seekers.
He even said that when translating Atmabodha, the words just flowed effortlessly as though already written.
Wow.
It speaks to a level of clarity and attunement that's truly remarkable.
Speaking of making ancient wisdom accessible, we can't forget the song Celestial. It's not an original work, but a compilation of 42 verses from the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes, he carefully selected and arranged these verses to highlight his core teachings. It's like he created a personalized guide to the Gita, emphasizing the verses that resonated most deeply with his own understanding.
This act of curation in itself is a teaching. It shows us that we can find wisdom and guidance from a variety of sources, even ancient texts, by engaging with them actively and extracting the essence that speaks to our own hearts.
It encourages us to approach these texts not as rigid doctrines, but as living sources of inspiration that can guide our own journeys of self-discovery.
As we reach the end of this deep dive into the life and works of Ramana Maharshi, I'm struck by this unexpected journey we've taken.
From his initial reluctance to write to those moments of spontaneous inspiration, from profound philosophical treatises to a playful poem about papadums, it's clear that his creative process was as unique as his teachings.
Yeah, it seems like there's a real playfulness to his creativity,
Yeah.
This willingness to engage with life fully, whether it was through deep philosophical inquiry or a lighthearted poem inspired by cooking with his mother.
Yes, and that playfulness reminds us that the spiritual path doesn't have to be serious or somber all the time.
Right.
There's a joy and lightness that can accompany the process of self-discovery.
Yeah, he was saying that enlightenment isn't about renouncing the world or suppressing our natural inclinations,
Right.
but about finding that divine spark within every experience.
Exactly. And if we look closely at his creative process, we see that it mirrors his message. Just as he encouraged us to find stillness within, to be present in the moment, his works often emerge from a place of receptivity, allowing the words to flow naturally without force or agenda.
And you wonder if that's why those spontaneous pieces like the Arunachala stanzas feel so powerful.
Right.
It's like they're coming from a place of pure inspiration,
Yes.
unfiltered by the thinking mind.
That's a really insightful observation. And it reminds us that creativity, like spirituality, can blossom when we let go of our preconceived notions and allow ourselves to be guided by something deeper.
So if even a simple recipe for papadums could spark a spiritual poem, what seemingly mundane aspects of your life might hold hidden depths waiting to be explored?
Yeah.
Perhaps a walk in nature, a conversation with a loved one,
Absolutely.
or even the act of preparing a meal could become a source of profound insight.
The key is to approach life with a sense of curiosity, openness, and a willingness to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. Just as Maharshi's works continue to inspire and guide seekers around the world, your own journey of self-discovery is waiting to unfold.
What a beautiful thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the life and works of Ramana Maharshi.
It's been my pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
I hope you like this chapter. We need volunteers and sponsors to create content with even better quality and with more variety. If you wish to join this initiative as a volunteer or sponsor, please click the links given in description below. To help us reach more viewers, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Biography Central. Thank you for your time. It means a lot. Namaste.